World-famous bedtime stories from Mom. Today's story is Snow White. Once upon a time, in a faraway kingdom, there was a princess with skin as white as snow and a heart just as pure. Her name was Snow White. Snow White lost her mother at a very young age, filling the kingdom with sorrow. One day the king brought home a beautiful queen from a neighboring country. The new queen was indeed beautiful, but her heart was filled with wickedness. In the queen's room was a very special item, a talking magic mirror. This mirror could reveal who was the fairest of them all. Every morning, the queen would stand before the mirror and ask, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" And the mirror would always respond, "My queen, you are the fairest of them all." The queen was very pleased to hear this. Every time she was told she was the fairest, it brought joy to her heart. As days passed, Snow White grew more and more beautiful. Her skin was as white as snow, her lips as red as roses, and her hair as black and shiny as the night sky. "What would you like to do today, Snow White?" the palace maids would always ask her. But Snow White preferred spending her time in the garden, full of blooming flowers, over the splendid palace. One day, while Snow White was singing with the flowers in the garden, small birds gathered around her. "Let's sing together, friends." Snow White enjoyed her time happily with the birds. Snow White's kindness was as beautiful as her appearance. She was kind to everyone, and the palace staff loved her dearly. The queen asked the mirror again, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" But today the mirror gave a different answer. "My queen, you are beautiful, but Snow White is the fairest of them all." The queen could not believe what she heard and asked again, "What are you saying? Is that true?" "Yes, my queen. It's true. Snow White is the fairest of them all." The queen's face turned red with rage. Her heart filled with anger and jealousy. "Snow White is more beautiful than me? That's unacceptable." The queen's heart was filled with rage and jealousy. She decided to get rid of Snow White, who she saw as a threat to her beauty. Thus she summoned the most trusted hunter in the palace. "Hunter, I have a very important task for you," said the queen. "Take Snow White into the forest and get rid of her." The hunter was shocked to hear the queen's command. "But, my queen, Snow White is the treasure of our kingdom. How can I?" "If you do not follow my orders, you too will face death," shouted the queen. The hunter had no choice but to take Snow White into the forest, though his heart was heavy and troubled. He knew well that Snow White was always kind and had a warm heart. On their way to the forest, Snow White shared joyful stories with the hunter. She marveled at the beauty of the forest and asked the hunter various questions. But the hunter's heart was torn between the queen's orders and compassion for Snow White. "How can I harm such a pure and beautiful child?" the hunter whispered to himself. Finally, when they reached deep into the forest, the hunter made his decision. "Snow White, I cannot harm you. The queen has ordered me to kill you, but I cannot do it." The hunter released Snow White and helped her safely escape. He then decided to deceive the queen. To trick the queen, the hunter killed a deer in the forest, took its heart, and presented it to the queen as Snow White's. Snow White ran into the forest. Her heart was filled with fear, but her steps did not falter. "Where should I go?" Snow White murmured to herself. The surroundings grew darker, and the forest seemed strange and frightening to her. But Snow White gathered her courage and continued to walk. "Don't be afraid, Snow White. You can do this," she encouraged herself. As she walked, Snow White encountered various animals, small rabbits, fluttering butterflies, and singing birds. They did not shy away from her but instead followed her. "Are you lost like me?" Snow White asked her animal friends. Though they could not respond, their eyes offered Snow White comfort. The forest was vast and complicated. Snow White had to avoid thorn bushes and climb over large rocks. She was tired and hungry, but she did not give up and kept walking. As night fell, the forest became an even scarier place. Strange noises filled the darkness, and Snow White did not know what awaited her. But she rested for a moment under a large tree and gazed at the stars. "This will all end. I will find my way," Snow White resolved under the starlight. As Snow White wandered through the forest, suddenly a small house appeared before her eyes. "Wow, who lives here?" Snow White curiously approached the house. The house looked very neat and tidy from the outside. Snow White gently knocked on the door, but there was no answer. "Is anyone there?" Snow White asked again, but it remained quiet. Full of curiosity, Snow White slowly opened the door and entered. What she found inside was surprisingly adorable. There were 7 small plates, cups, and spoons on a tiny table. "Who lives here?" Snow White murmured to herself. She looked around the house in awe. Everything was so orderly and clean. There were even 7 small chairs and beds. Snow White was exhausted from her long journey. She carefully sat on one of the beds and felt so comfortable that she lay down. "I'll just close my eyes for a moment," Snow White thought. Shortly after, Snow White fell into a deep sleep. She felt a sense of relief, having found a safe place away from the dangers of the forest. The 7 dwarfs were returning home from mining gold in the mountains that day. After a long day's work, they were heading back to their little house. "We did a lot of work today." The dwarfs encouraged each other as they entered their home. But as soon as they stepped inside, they felt something unusual. "Someone has been here. Look, there are traces of used plates on the table," said the first dwarf. "And here, someone has used my bed," exclaimed the second dwarf in surprise. All 7 dwarfs began to check their beds and belongings. Then they discovered Snow White sleeping in the bed at the very back. "Wow, who is this?" The dwarfs were astonished and looked at each other. Snow White was sleeping beautifully, and looking at her peaceful face, all the dwarfs felt their hearts melt. "She's a really beautiful lady," whispered the third dwarf. "But how did she get here?" wondered the fourth dwarf. The dwarfs decided not to wake Snow White. "Let's wait until the lady wakes up. When she does, we can hear the whole story," suggested the fifth dwarf. So the dwarfs quietly gathered around Snow White, waiting for her to wake up. They gazed at Snow White, who was sleeping adorably. When Snow White gently opened her eyes, she discovered 7 pairs of curious eyes surrounding her. "Where am I?" Snow White asked cautiously. "We are 7 dwarfs who mine gold in the mountains," answered the first dwarf. "But how did you get here?" Snow White shared her story with the dwarfs, one by one. After she finished, the dwarfs all felt sympathy for Snow White. "It might be dangerous for you to stay here," said the second dwarf worriedly. "But don't worry. We'll help you." Snow White and the 7 dwarfs decided to live together. The dwarfs taught Snow White how to help with the housework, and every day when the dwarfs returned from work, Snow White prepared a delicious dinner for them. "Snow White, with you here, our home has become much brighter," said the third dwarf. The dwarfs loved listening to Snow White's songs and stories. Snow White gradually became accustomed to life with the dwarfs. She deeply appreciated how the dwarfs treated her like family. "Thank you all for becoming my new family," said Snow White. Thus Snow White and the 7 dwarfs helped each other and spent their days filled with laughter and joy. Their home was always full of happiness and laughter. The queen stood in front of the mirror once again and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" But the mirror's answer was not what the queen expected. "My queen, you are indeed beautiful, but Snow White, who lives with the 7 dwarfs in the forest, is the fairest of them all." The queen trembled with rage. "Snow White is still alive? I must eliminate her myself." She began to devise a new plan for revenge. The queen decided to disguise herself so no one could recognize her. She rummaged through an old wardrobe to find clothes and accessories that would make her look like a witch. "With these clothes and this mask, no one will recognize me," the queen whispered as she began to change her appearance. She also wore an old scarf to cover her hair and a large hat to conceal her face. The queen stood in front of the mirror to check her disguise. "And now, I look like a perfect old woman. Snow White will never recognize me." With that, the queen set out to find Snow White in the forest. Disguised, the queen entered the forest, holding a beautiful comb poisoned with her hands. "I'll deceive Snow White with this comb. She won't be able to resist its beauty." Knowing that Snow White would be alone while the dwarfs were at work, the queen approached the dwarf's house and knocked on the door. When Snow White opened the door, she was surprised to see a kind-looking old woman standing before her. "Hello, grandmother. Can I help you with anything?" "Oh, my pretty girl. I'm a merchant who sells this beautiful comb. It will suit you perfectly," the queen said in a disguised voice, showing the comb to Snow White. Snow White was enchanted by the beauty of the comb. "It's really beautiful, grandmother. But my dear, this is a gift for you. Try it," the queen insisted kindly, handing the comb to Snow White. Snow White found it hard to refuse and accepted the comb, beginning to brush her long hair with it. The moment the poisoned comb touched Snow White's hair, she collapsed. The queen internally celebrated as she escaped the forest. "And now Snow White will no longer threaten my beauty." When the 7 dwarfs returned home from mining gold and found Snow White collapsed on the floor, they were shocked and rushed to her side. "Snow White, are you okay?" the first dwarf asked worriedly. But Snow White did not respond. Then the second dwarf noticed the strange comb stuck in Snow White's hair. Look what's here. This comb. Check it out," he shouted to the others. The dwarfs carefully removed the comb, and at that moment Snow White slowly began to regain consciousness. Everyone, how did I get here?" The dwarfs helped Snow White up and explained what had happened to her. "Snow White, you were in danger. This comb was poisoned." Snow White was shocked and thanked the dwarfs for saving her. "If it weren't for you, I would have been in real trouble." Afterward, the dwarfs warned Snow White, "Snow White, don't let anyone into the house from now on. Especially when we're not here, okay?" Snow White took the dwarf's words to heart and promised to be more careful in the future. "I understand, dwarf friends. I'll listen to you and make sure no more dangerous things happen." The queen learned that her first attempt had failed. But she did not give up and devised a more cunning plan. This time I will not fail. I must get rid of Snow White. She decided to use a poisoned apple this time. The queen went to her alchemy lab and injected the most potent poison into the apple. One side of the apple was made to look poison-free to deceive Snow White. After poisoning the apple, the queen disguised herself once more, this time more carefully to ensure no one could recognize her. With this appearance, even Snow White will not recognize me. The queen put the poisoned apple in a basket and, pretending to be an old woman selling apples, headed to the dwarf's house. She waited for a moment when the dwarfs were away from the house to encounter Snow White. Upon reaching the dwarf's house, the queen called out in a friendly voice, "Would you like to see some apples? These apples are delicious." Snow White was initially cautious, but the apple the queen offered looked so tempting. "That apple looks really delicious." "Yes, my dear. This apple is special. Just one bite and you'll feel the happiest in the whole world," the queen lied, enticing Snow White. Snow White hesitated for a moment but eventually fell for the queen's deceit and accepted the apple. As soon as she bit into the apple, the poison spread through her body. The queen smiled with satisfaction as Snow White collapsed. "And now Snow White will no longer threaten my beauty." The moment Snow White bit into the poisoned apple, her eyes began to close and she fell into a deep sleep. It was such a profound sleep that Snow White could not wake up from it, as if she had fallen into an eternal slumber. When the dwarfs returned home in the evening, they found Snow White collapsed on the floor. "Snow White!" They rushed to her side, alarmed. The dwarfs tried their best to wake Snow White, but no matter how hard they tried, she would not awaken. Their home was filled with sorrow and worry. What happened here? Why is Snow White like this? They noticed the half-eaten apple and said, "This apple must have been poisoned." Snow White ate it and ended up like this. The dwarfs did everything they could for Snow White. They made her comfortable and continued to pray for her to wake up. But Snow White remained in her deep sleep. As days passed, the dwarfs' hearts grew heavier and heavier. They feared losing Snow White. We hope our beloved Snow White can return to us." In the middle of the forest, in a place where time seemed to stand still, Snow White lay peacefully inside a glass coffin made with love by the 7 dwarfs. Her face was peaceful, and even in the sleep of death, she remained breathtakingly beautiful, with breath still seemingly present. One day a prince traveling through the forest stumbled upon this place and was captivated by Snow White's beauty, her pure white skin, ruby red lips, and coal-black hair. Drawn to her beauty, the prince approached the glass coffin and, captivated by Snow White, kissed her pale forehead with love and reverence. At that moment, something magical happened. The prince's pure love-filled kiss broke the curse of the poisoned apple. Suddenly, Snow White's heart began to beat gently, her cheeks regained color, and she slowly woke from her deep sleep. Taking a deep breath and opening her eyes, Snow White locked eyes with the prince, and at that moment, they both fell in love at first sight. Tears of joy streaming down his face, the prince confessed his love to Snow White. "Snow White, I love you. Will you marry me?" Moved by the prince's warm words, Snow White's heart was touched, and they promised to marry each other. Meanwhile, the queen heard that Snow White was still alive and went to find the princess. She sneaked into Snow White and the prince's wedding but was caught by the soldiers. The soldiers rushed to the queen and put on her red-hot iron shoes. The queen began to jump around as if she were dancing with joy. And so the queen kept dancing. Snow White and the prince lived happily ever after for many years to come. Thank you for listening to the end. Click on the playlist for more stories. Your subscription, likes, and notifications greatly support me.